everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today we are going to dye a yak blend. This yarn is that yak sock from Wool to Die For, and it's 70% superwash merino, 20% yak, 10% nylon. The starting color is actually a fairly neutral, almost oatmeal-like color. You do see a little bit of some hints of barber pulling on the yarn already, which I am pointing out now because I have a feeling that this could become more prominent later on, depending on the technique, because the wool fibers, which are paler, might take up color a little brighter than the brown of the yak. I have dyed this blend once before, also in a Dyepot PS episode, and I overdyed it with some fluorescent speckles, and it was gorgeous. I was unsure about using neon colors over something that is fairly muted already, but this is pale enough that a lot of color can still show up on it, versus some darker natural browns where maybe you might need to use a lot more dye to pump up the color. Today, I thought it would be fun to dye this yarn in a few depths of shade of one color to see how it turns out and to get a sense of how much pigment you need for it to feel different from the bare yarn. I have not yet decided if I'll do a side-by-side and then also do the same technique on some just 100% wool or wool nylon blend. I think we'll see how it looks like this is going, but let's go ahead and get started. I pre-soaked the yarn overnight in some plain tap water. I did add a removable nylon zip tie onto it just to keep these 20-gram mini skeins ordered and so they wouldn't get tangled. If you'd like to learn more about the yarn base or other tools and equipment I'm using, I do have links down in the video description, so those are worth checking out. For our project today, I decided to go for Extreme Blue, a Dharma acid dye, and I have only used this once to do a crude swatch, so I honestly have no idea how it performs as a stock solution or anything like that, but yeah, I think that this is the color that I want to try, which maybe I will regret, I don't know. And the only reason why I might regret it is if the color is so intense we don't see a lot of difference between it at different depths of shade, but that's also a reason why it's worth playing with different depths of shade when you are looking at different yarn bases. Depth of shade is a numerical term to quantify the amount of dye that you used per the amount of fiber. So for example, a 1% depth of shade would be 1 gram of dye per 100 grams of fiber. And this term is really helpful for when you want to compare one color to itself. So that way you know if you want to make a color that is more pastel, you should use less dye, or more saturated, you need to use more. And so it's a term that is useful especially for doing recipes. And so doing some kind of set like this can be really, really helpful for you to get the shade that you want. If you're dyeing, say, a sweater's quantity or something, it's worth trying it on minis before going and doing a huge volume and getting something that is too pigmented or not pigmented enough. It is important to keep in mind that the depth of shade is in reference to a particular color or a mixture or something that you've made, versus being like an absolute definition of a shade that you might see, like a Pantone, the depth of color that you see on a color swatch. So if you're looking at a 1% depth of shade of true black versus silver gray, the true black is going to be way, way more saturated, even though you used 1 gram of dye of each. And that's because the gram of dye of the gray is more dilute. There's less actual dye in there, but these numbers may not help you determine how much black you need to make that same color as gray, unless you do sort of like a fade, like I did in the math of yarn dyeing. Then you can compare and figure out what you might need to go from one to the other. But the depth of shade is a number that really helps you compare one color to itself in different quantities, so you get a sense of how much you want to use to get the color that you want. And it's at this point that I will point out it is a lot more accurate to measure dyes by weight versus by volume, because the weight of dye powder per teaspoon of different dyes can vary a lot. And so for consistency, that's why we talk about these colors in terms of grams. But if you are working with your own recipes and you're going by volume and you don't mind if things shift a little bit, that's fine. So today I'm going to look at 5 depths of shade ranging from 2% to 0.125%. And the change in each of these is each one of them is half the amount of dye as the previous one. This is a good way to get a range of colors for most dyes. Some maybe you need to be more extreme, but for a lot of colors you should get a reasonable range within here, or at least learn, because maybe extreme blue is extreme, that maybe we need to go even smaller if we want to see a pastel color. But that's something that we'll learn today. A 2% depth of shade would be 2 grams of dye per 100 grams of yarn, which is how it is defined. I did all these calculations for 100 grams. We will be dyeing 20 grams, so if I were to weigh out the amount of dye I needed for each sample, you would take this and divide it by 5 for each of them. And it starts to get pretty hard to measure out really small quantities of dye. And so this is one reason why we make a stock solution. Now, a 1% stock solution is 1 gram of dye dissolved in 100 milliliters of water. So the number of milliliters of a 1% dye stock we would need for each of these colors are numbers that are fairly easy to measure out. It's a lot easier to measure out 12.5 milliliters of liquid than it would be to measure out 0.125 grams of dye with accuracy. And so that is a big reason why you might want to make a dye stock, because it makes measuring things really, really easy. Now, if we wanted to go even smaller than this and the volume started to get really, really small, then maybe you want to make a different concentration for your dye stock to make whatever your smallest numbers are as manageable as possible. But even as we take these numbers, which are the calculated amount of dye we would need for dyeing 100 grams in each of the colors, and we divide them by 5, it is still really, really easy to measure out between 2.5 milliliters of dye and 40 milliliters of dye. I have graduated cylinders and syringes that make this very easy for me to achieve. And so therefore this is a manageable range. Now, this exercise is also worth doing because it shows, okay, I need less than 100 milliliters of dye. And so you can use that to help you decide how much of your dye stock you might want to make. But I have more plans for extreme blue for other videos, so I will probably make about half a liter of our dye stock. To make a half liter 1% stock solution, I measured out 5 grams of the extreme blue dye. And since I'm dealing with a dye powder, I am wearing a respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves. And once I measured out the dye, I added hot water to dissolve it, stirred and stirred and stirred, and then increased the volume, so the total volume of our solution would be 500 milliliters. This is technically the most accurate way to do it. There is a volume to the dye itself, and so it is more accurate to measure out the volume of your stock solution versus add 500 milliliters of liquid to your dye. But really, as long as you're consistent, it's the little bit of difference probably wouldn't make a big deal. But doing it this way does come from my research scientist background. While we're stirring everything up, I want to take this opportunity to give a huge thank you and shout out to Wolf Safira, Jessica Parco, Claire, Karen Siegel, and the rest of the Fiber patrons. You'll see a lot of their names on the screen right now. Patreon is a really great platform for viewers like you to support the content here on the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel. And I offer perks that include shout outs, behind the scenes sneak peeks, and more. You can find more details over at the Patreon, which you can find a link to it down in the video description. we are gonna set up our dyes and put our minis in my mason jars. I'm very, very excited. Now, I went through already the amount of dye that I want to add to each of them, but I want to start by adding water to sort of compensate for the volume. The volumes are small enough that I don't think it is really that critical that we have the same volume of liquid in here for each of them, but there's no harm in doing this. So for the lightest shade, I just added 47.5 milliliters. Now I'm going to add 45. Then I'm going to add 40, 30 milliliters. And then coming and using my syringe, I'll just quickly add 10. In terms of the colors that we're gonna get, the volume of dye and water that we put in here doesn't matter a lot. But since we're probably gonna end up with a tonal versus a semi-solid, I figured it would be useful for me to try to control the volume of water to have the volume of liquid be the same across all of the containers. And so that's just why I started doing this water, so that way by the time I add our dye, we will have equivalent of 50 milliliters of liquid in each of them. But this step, again, is not that necessary. Okay, so now let's start with, again, our most pastel. I do have some color here that, oh, I actually did a good job. I have some color here that is our 1% stock solution. I just didn't add it to the bottle because of, it would then be easier to measure if I'm not already in the bottle. So that was 2.5 milliliters. Now 5. Then we're going to do 10. And the reason why I'm using different syringes is that it is better in terms of accuracy to measure as few times as possible. You introduce less error in. Again, this is not something that is that big of a deal in terms of dyeing yarn. To do the 20 milliliters, I could have just done 10 twice. But some habits are really hard to shake. And so that's why I'm doing that this way. Okay. Okay, so again, we have the same volume of liquid in each of these right now. But the thing is that it will be hard to see the color difference right now. I mean, I can see looking down a little bit of a gradient, but let's add more volume of water to each of the jars. I quickly added 300 milliliters of plain tap water to each of the jars. The volume of water that we're using does not really matter here. What matters more is, again, the amount of dye that we added. All that the total amount of water is doing can in fact change the effect or tonal nature. And so if you look here, I just took like a little finger dip of each of the colors, and lightest to darkest, we do have a gradient here. Even though it might not look super extreme yet, based on the way that the jars look. But now let's add the dye. But now let's add the yarn. I removed most of the liquid from the pre-soak. Oh, I could have put a zip tie on each individual one. That may have actually not been a bad idea. But I removed the water from the pre-soak, and I'm now just slowly adding the yarn. 20 grams of yarn to each of the jars. But yeah, it might have been helpful to have a zip tie on here, because then I could raise and lower it, but it's not a big deal. Those reusable nylon zip ties are amazing though. Okay, adding you, and then adding you. There is no acid in here yet, but we will add acid shortly. Now I need a spoon, so that way I can gently stir the yarn and move it so it can access the dye. Again, these are fairly crowded, so we will have various, ooh, that's cool looking. Since the jars are fairly crowded, we will have tonal yarn in here, but I want to at least give it a shot to have the yarn have access to the dye. And I think that this is going to look so, so cool. I'm really, really excited. It's hard to know exactly how things will turn out, but from these quick looks inside the jars, I'm really, really curious how this more pastel one will look. It looks really, really, I don't know if you guys probably can't see very well. The most pastel one looks fairly gray at the moment, where the most pigmented one looks blue. It's hard because it's a brown, and so there is clearly some yellow or orange in there, but how warm or cool, I don't know. But now let's add some acid. I'm gonna add 1 teaspoon or 5 milliliters of white vinegar to each of the jars. This is actually a reasonable amount of acid, considering a proportion I often start with is 2 tablespoons, so 30 milliliters of acid per 8 cups of water. And goodness, if a half cup is a bit over 100 milliliters, then maybe we've got, I don't know, around a cup or so. So I'm just quickly stirring this up. Again, we will have something tonal. Now, I'm okay using the same spoon because I'm going from lightest to darkest. So the little bit amount of dye that might still be on my spoon from going from here into here isn't going to change this color. But if I was going the reverse way, from the darkest into the lightest, that could be enough dye to shift that color because of the way the dilutions are. So that is just my rationale there. But already, I don't know how much you guys can see. Already this one's looking quite blue. Ooh, this one is gorgeous. Very, very dark. Very awesome. It's always good when at this stage you can tell there's a visual difference between your palest and your darkest. Some colors like yellow can be a lot harder, and you might need to have a more extreme darkest and lightest, because yellow is not super saturated on its own, but that's a whole other story. Now let's go ahead and start heating this yarn so we can set the color. To heat the yarn, I've added our 5 mason jars inside a pasta insert of my dedicated dye pot. And here you can see our lightest color versus our darkest that's right there. And I have added a water level so that the water in this bath is just below the water level that we have in our jars, and I'm going to heat things up. And so by heating the water bath, we'll be heating the water in these jars, but since they're not on the bottom of the pan, they won't get too much heat and risk cracking or rattle really loudly or anything like that. And so now I'm going to heat this until, oh goodness, I'm going to heat this for at least 30 minutes once it gets hot. So it'll probably be heating between 45 minutes and an hour, depending on how long it takes everything to heat up. But at that point, I'll come back. Heating too long is never really an issue. The issue could just be maybe you need the dye pot for another project or something like that. So anyway, we'll come back and see if at that point we need to add more acid for our more concentrated colors. For comparison's sake, I just added 12 milliliters of our 1% stock solution to a non-specified amount of water. I'm not worrying a ton about the volume here because I thought it would be fun to dye 100 grams of Knit Picks Stroll fingering weight yarn in our lightest depth of shade that we are using today. This yarn is 75% superwash merino, 25% nylon, and it is an off-white in bare form, which we'll be able to compare versus doing mini skeins. So we'll compare this to the lightest shade we see on the yak. I'm going to start heating things up, and I am going to go ahead and add, I think, just 1 tablespoon of white vinegar here to the pot. Now I do plan to eventually do the darkest shade, so a 2% depth of shade in this blue as well. But you can already see that there is a lot of color in 8.125% depth of shade of this color. And I don't know why it is acting a little tangly. But we are absolutely going to have a tonal here, so there will be some spots that are a little deeper and a little paler. But I think in terms of the tone of the blue that we see here, it'll be really nice to compare this with what we're seeing on the yak. So I am going to heat this until the color is cleared, and then we'll reset and do this in the deeper shade. Meanwhile, our yak is hot, and the colors, it looks on camera, I don't think you can see it. I feel like it looks more muted than it does look in person, even though I guess they are fairly muted. But here is that palest blue, and just mentally compare that to what we just saw on our stroll. But this is beautiful, and yeah, we'll check in when the timer goes off. All right, let's see. So what's interesting is the palest one feels almost a little bit more turquoise, and then okay, those two are clear. Let's check the deepest one. I do see some more blue. I'm sort of blocking you. There's more blue in there, but I think that the deeper shades do overpower the natural color, where you sort of feel that more in this palest one. But I'm going to go ahead and add more vinegar to our darkest shades. The two lightest ones have cleared, so I don't feel the need to add. So I'm adding 2 more teaspoons to those 3 darker colors, and just an additional 1 to our paler colors. And then just doing a quick little stir. Let's check this one and see. There's a hint of some color in, I guess, number 3, and then more in 4 and 5. Cool. So again, things have not been that hot yet. We're not yet at a simmer in our bath, so that's just worth keeping in mind. But I think I'm going to go ahead and leave the heat on for another 30 minutes. After 30 minutes, and it's been at a bigger boil, less boil, there's still a hint of color in there. Hopefully we won't see a lot of bleeding. I see a hint in the second most, oh dear, concentrated one. So at this point I am going to turn off the heat and let everything cool slowly, and it'll stay warm for a long time until I remove these from the pan. So I'll just let it cool off slowly in here. That'll give it more heat, more time, and then once I can comfortably handle everything, then we'll come and talk some more. Look at how blue this is. Oh my goodness. Okay, let's check. All right, all of that color is in the yarn. And so I am going to turn off the heat. I'll let this cool a little bit in the pot, then we'll remove it, reset the pot with cool water so we can dye a 2% depth of shade. And the reason for resetting with cool water and no acid again is just to get more even coverage of the yarn. Otherwise, with it hot and with some acid, some of the color would start striking right away, and so I'm just aiming for a little bit of consistency. Our pot has reset, and I'm coming in with 200 milliliters of our extreme blue dye stock. Whoo-wee, this is a lot of color. One might even call it extreme. Sorry, I really couldn't help myself. Here is another pre-soaked skein of Knit Pick Stroll fingering weight yarn. You can see how much more intense the color is right away. And once again, I'm not dip dyeing per se. I am just dipping the yarn to help distribute the dye all the way through. This time I'm gonna go ahead and add 3 tablespoons of white vinegar. This is more, but there's a lot of dye in here, and I know it's gonna take a lot for all of the color to absorb, although things should start happening a bit faster now that the acid is in here. And I'm just trying to move this through so we get some even color. But oh, this is a great blue. Oh my goodness. Anyway, now I'm gonna turn on the heat, heat it up to a simmer for at least 30 minutes, and then we'll check back in. So I'm probably gonna set a timer for between 45 minutes to an hour, just because I know it's gonna take some time for the temperature to come up, since we are starting with a completely cool bath right now. But the goal is to have it hot for at least 30 minutes. Okay, there is still a lot of blue in here, and the blue in the yarn is rather intense, but let's add more acid. 2, 3, 4. I mean, the problem with not measuring the amount of water is that I don't know exactly how much, the problem with not measuring the water is that I don't know exactly what my proportions of acid are, but this color is amazing. It's amazing. All right, I am going to just keep this on medium-low heat for another 30 minutes, and then we'll come back. Okay, I just checked. There's a lot of blue left in there. I am going to turn off the heat, let the yarn cool in here completely, and add a big old splash of vinegar. And so we will see how things are in a couple hours once it cools. It is the next morning, and I left the yarn in here overnight to cool. And I'm happy to report that that's looking really, really clear. So let's go wash this concentrated extreme blue first. The reason why I want to do the extreme blue first is because if there's no bleeding here, then that means that we're less likely to see bleeding on our yak minis. And if we see a lot of bleeding here, then we can troubleshoot it on a full skein and then know if I need to wash the minis separately or something like that. So, I mean, I see like a tiny hint that is so pale it's hard to know if it is a reflection, but I have a feeling that when we add soap, it's funny, both blues and pinks can be tricky in their own way. So fingers crossed that we're not going to see this turn bright blue, but it might. Okay. The water is cold, and we are seeing some bleeding here with the addition of soap. It's always a bummer when that happens, so maybe this blue is just way intense. I am going to go grab the Simple Fold. So this is a low foam textile dye specific, oh dear, that was way too much. Oh crap, that was way too much. But this is a soap that is specifically intended for dyeing yarn and to help bind and remove excess dye without the dye going and binding to other fiber. So like if you had whites, then it should help that. And we're pulling a lot out right now, which maybe is good, but I used way too much. So I'm a little concerned about that. Oh my God, that's a lot. But the thing is, I see a lot of color in there. This is still just as vibrant. So that is one reason why I'm not immediately freaked out. I do have a standalone Central video that has been filmed, not yet edited. It has not yet been released and put formally on the schedule. So that is something that is coming. And knowing that this is the bleeder, maybe I'll have to think about that. So I don't know. I mean, clearly we're still seeing blue come out. There's still definitely soap in the yarn. I will say that my conclusions when I tried this with Purple Pop is that, well, my Purple Pop yarn didn't have as much bleeding as I expected, so I wasn't able to give a super firm, like, this was faster than using dish soap conclusion. So I don't know if it's more magical. It's probably gentler on your fibers than dish soap, maybe. I don't know. But I did use a ton. In theory, using too much shouldn't be causing more bleeding or something. It's just going to take longer to rinse out. But that is a lot of bleeding, and I am not happy with it at all. So I think what I want to do is finish rinsing out the soap. Again, like, what we're not seeing is when I'm running water over the yarn, we're not seeing the yarn have the pigment rinse out. The yarn does not look that different to how it looked before we started rinsing it. So, I mean, that's good, but I don't like that. And so if this amount of bleeding happens with, I mean, this amount of bleeding could not possibly happen with the pale yarn on the stroll, purely because there wasn't that much dye. But if this amount of bleeding happens on the mini skein, then I'm about to rethink what I do with this blue going forward. Which is a bummer because this color is so extreme. It's a beautiful, beautiful blue. But this amount of bleeding is not acceptable to me. So here's what I think I want to do. This is the dye bath that we had used. I'm actually going to put the yarn straight back in the dye bath because there's a lot of vinegar in here, and so I am just going to leave it in here to soak for a bit. Sometimes you know, a pH difference can make a difference. And note that water was just bleeding. I popped it in here and I'm not seeing any color come out anymore. So sometimes adding a bit of acid to your wash could be helpful. But let's go wash the paler skein. I think I will wash the minis all together now that I know, but I'm not going, I don't know, it's something interesting because I haven't heard a lot of chatter about extreme blue, and I'm just using dish soap right now. I haven't heard a lot of chatter about extreme blue, of it being a pain to work with, much like Purple Pop is notorious. But it's possible, just like I now know, I don't want to use Purple Pop at a 1% depth of shade because that's way, way, way too much of that dye. It is so potent that you want to use a lot less. Maybe the same is for extreme blue, but I am not seeing any bleeding whatsoever with our palest shade. And I truly don't think that this is a dish soap versus Synthropol situation or anything like that. I think that it is purely a maybe 2% was too much dye. And so maybe we'll see. But I do think I'm going to wash all of the minis together. But anyway, I am going to take this skein, rinse it, make sure all the soap's out, put it through the spin dryer, and hang it up to dry. I found my pH paper, and because I am curious, let's check See if my tap water has changed. Okay, and we're still, the pH paper is sort of like a nice orangey color. I would say it's at a pH about 6, so it's a little bit acidic, which is why I often don't have as many problems as some other people might. The color change with the litmus paper is always more dramatic when something is basic versus acidic, but so here is the pH of just vinegar, which is probably closer to, it's between a 3 and a 4. Probably. So vinegar is a lot more acidic than my tap water, which is really, really good. It hasn't been that long. And I just removed this yarn from its dip back in the acid. And I mean, right now I'm not seeing any bleeding. So I don't have a very good answer to the chemistry, but let's do a test. So I don't want to use as much. I just want to use like a drop of the synthropol and see if we have bleeding happen again, because that's what caused the bleeding last time. And so I don't know if the synthropol changes the pH. I don't know if I should try adding acid along with the wash. But oh, that's not bad. What? That's really not bad. Did I add too much before? I don't know, because it's supposed to be, I think, the synthropol is supposed to be neutral. So I don't know, but either way, we are not bleeding anymore. So I'm happy. But whenever you have a really intense color, and whether it is hand dyed or commercially dyed, I do recommend doing a bleed test before mixing it with something that is white, for example. So I am seeing a hint of bleeding, but compared to before, that isn't something that I find particularly worrisome. So what I'm going to do is add just a fraction, I don't know why I put the square on, a fraction of a teaspoon, fraction of a tablespoon of some vinegar to our rinse to make it a little more acidic. And I will say, I'm on cold tap water. It is really, really, really cold right now. My hands are uncomfortable being in there. And that has stopped it. So everyone, remind me to put a note that add a little bit of acid to soaks or washes with this. But I'm going to go ahead and put this through my spin dryer with the other skein, and let's get ready to wash our yak. These colors are so much more muted. Still super intense and saturated, especially the one on the far right, but nowhere near as bright, and that's because of the difference in the natural fiber color. Now, the first thing that I want to do, this is our most intense one, and I don't see any color left in the jar, but we know that that doesn't mean we won't see it in, where did that strand, okay, so we might not see it in the yarn. And so I am preparing now to add a zip tie so that way I can try to keep things ordered. Ooh. So the first one, the darkest one, is almost navy. That one feels almost like, I don't know. These blues are beautiful. They are absolutely beautiful. I think that's the palest one. It feels almost like there's a bit of yellow in them, which, given that we had a brown, isn't too extreme. And this one feels very gray. So maybe the blue and the brown sort of toned each other a little bit. But now I'm going to add a zip tie to this so that way we can do our best to keep from tangling the yarn. Let's do a rinse in some plain water, and then we will add some soap because different fibers will absorb dye differently. And this is also superwash merino, and I believe I think we had nylon in here. I'll double check for the end. But we also had that yak. So right now I see maybe a hint that doesn't concern me, but ooh, these colors are delightful. They are delicious together. Okay, and there's a tiny bit of Synthropol on the outside of the bottle. So I'm just gonna rinse that. And we're gonna cross our fingers, but probably we'll see some bleeding. Or maybe not. That's not bad. We'll see what happens when I squeeze it. Oh, that's really not bad. That's not bad at all. Okay. I am relieved. I am so relieved. I mean, just because it won't hurt, I'll add a tiny bit of acid. But it's really compared to what we saw before. Now granted, the total amount of dye on these 5 skeins is less than what we had on that one dark skein, but oh, I am so relieved because I wanted to use this color for another project, but I had already decided I'm not going to go as high as a 2% depth of shade for that, even though the color is awesome. So this set is so pretty. Anyway, I'm gonna rinse it 1 or 2 more times, put this through my spin dryer, and we'll come back and compare all the colors to each other and the yarn, and yay! Finally, I don't want to leave any dye behind. And we've got some leftovers from our various measuring paraphernalia from when we made the dye stock, but also when we were dyeing our yarn. Now, this isn't that much dye, but we'll see what we get. We've got right here a skein of Knit Picks Swish Decay, which normally goes into water really easily, but it is going in rather slowly right now. There we go. And I'm lifting and moving it so that way we can attempt to get, the color will be a little uneven, but to sort of move around where some of that unevenness is located, especially if colors are starting to strike right away. This was a dry skein of Swish Decay, which I'm a little surprised because usually this yarn does sort of sink in really quickly, and it's not doing that for me today. But you can also see a lot of the color is clearing already in here. Not that there was a lot of color, but there's definitely bits of the yarn that still feel dry. But I'm gonna heat things up. I just wanted to move it around. It's not, I mean, it's not like exactly dip dyed or something, but this is just a nice way to use up that leftover dye. So I'm gonna heat this for, I would say 20 to 30 minutes. Then we'll wash it and we'll show it at the end of the video, but I'm not gonna show the washing for this one. I'm not expecting it to be a problem. And this is that same dye bath that I've been using all day. Here are the 5 colors we got on this yak blend, which again is 70% superwash merino, 20% yak, 10% nylon. And these blues range from a deep blue all the way into more of a grayish blue. All of them are a transformation from where we were with our undyed yarn, which was sort of a pale brownish gray. And this brown, those more yellow tones, really come through, I think, in the palest 2 skeins. I think that by the time we are at just a 0.125% depth of shade, which is equivalent to 0.125 grams of dye per 100 grams of yarn, or even this one that is just 0.25 grams of dye, or that is just the equivalent of 0.25 grams of dye per 100 grams. That's probably not enough to overcome some of that dustiness that we had in the bare yarn. By the time we're at a 0.5% DOS or all the way up to a 2% DOS, then there's enough dye that, well, as you'll see in a moment, it does shift the final color, but you don't necessarily realize with these three that you are potentially over dyeing something. The colors don't feel as dusty because if you consider the color in the bare yarn to be color, the ratio of your dye to that color that existed in the yarn shifts as you add more and more dye. When we bring in our stroll, which is 75% superwash merino, and the bare yarn color was more of an off-white, now you can really see how much of a difference that natural color that we had in the yak made with our extreme blue. So for reference, here is the bare stroll, and here is the bare yak. They are absolutely different. Even though this color is not that pigmented, it does make a huge difference in the blues that we see. Again, I feel like the biggest difference is at the palest end, where these two blues had the same proportion of dye to yarn, and one of them looks way more gray than the other, which is a beautiful, it doesn't really feel that pastel, honestly, especially when we see the leave no dye behind skein. This blue does not feel very pastel. There is absolutely a difference in the brightness with the 2% depth of shade of the extreme blue. This is almost, it's so bright. It is so bright. It's, I guess neon isn't quite the right word because it doesn't feel a neon blue, but I do feel electricity. It feels extreme, true to its name, and it makes this deep blue here feel more navy almost. I would say, but even comparing it to this one, this almost feels like it has more green in it because, well, it kind of does from that brown that was the base color. Remember how I said that this palest blue stroll wasn't going to feel super pale in a moment? Well, here was our leave no dye behind, and it is super pastel. I'm feeling a little perplexed because it doesn't seem like it's in the same color family. It feels way more green, this dilute. But the thing to keep in mind is that bare yarn does have a tiny bit of yellow in it. It's not a pure white, it's a bit of an off-white. And so what I might be seeing here, where this feels like there's a little bit of a yellow undertone, whereas I don't feel that here, is because since there's so much less dye, we're feeling some of that tone from our bare yarn, which in this case was swish DK, come through in a similar way that we see some more of the tone of the yak come through in the palest skein here. At least that is my hypothesis. We have seen in some other videos, I think specifically in a Felici, where it's breaking grape Kool-Aid on it, where a hint of blue in the end almost toned the yarn that was left. So it felt more like a white versus the off-white that you feel in bare yarn. So this isn't that unusual, but I am a little surprised by the tone, if that makes sense. We learned a lot in this video, and not just that extreme blue is a very extreme blue. I don't think it counts as a primary, but honestly, I don't know at the moment. The color is gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous and pigmented, and rivals gosh, I'm really, really, really happy with it and am excited to play with it more in the future. I am also really excited by this yak blend. I definitely want to try to find more yarn that has a higher yak percentage to it to dye and explore. But I think the caveat there is that if there's more of the yak fiber, the color of the bare yarn is going to be deeper, which means that it's going to be harder and harder to get different hues because using something that is almost so blue that you can, I mean, I can look at it, but so blue you can barely describe it. It is such an intense blue without being really dark. It gave us these gorgeous muted blues on the yak. So I don't think there's a dye that you could use that would give this a bright neon type color, although the neons were beautiful on it. So I think that it's worth keeping that in mind as you play around with dyeing natural fibers that aren't just a off-white. And this is one reason why I've become sort of a swatching convert. I suppose I'm still not making swatch cards and a recipe book for myself. I'm more likely to refer to photos to try to get the colors that I want. But it is certainly worth swatching a color appropriately like this that we did on the yak before you go and dye a much larger quantity. So if I wanted to go and make like a shawl fade set, maybe this is a great way by doing this on mini skeins for me to decide the colors that I wanted for the shawl and to get the hues that I want on 20 grams before dyeing more yarn. Similarly, if I wanted to do a sweater quantities worth, this way you can get the color that you want. Now, I also really enjoy a method of swatching that is crudely using the dye powder on a skein to see how they compare to one another in dry form. This kind of swatching this crude swatching is really useful if your primary way of dyeing is to dye with the dry powders, because the intensity and hues that you see in the powder might be quite different from what you see on the label, on the lid, on a swatch card from the dye manufacturer. And so it's a great way to compare the hues of different colors to one another crudely. But it doesn't really help you determine how much of this color do I need to get the final depth of shade that I want on yarn. And so that's the reason why doing something like this, even if you're just gonna do the 1% depth of shade on a bunch of different yarn bases, doing this kind of swatching of colors is a really great way to understand more about them. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and thank you so much for watching this video. I'd like to give another huge thank you and shout out to all of my ChemKnits patrons for supporting the content on the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel and my journey in exploring fiber and color. And well, we're many, many years into Dyepot Weekly and Dyepot PS, but I still feel like I'm at the beginning of my journey. And there is still so much more to explore, so many colors to play with, so many fibers to dye. And if you want to come along on the journey, please subscribe and make sure your notifications are on and leave comments below. The biggest way that you can support the content here on this channel is by engaging with the videos, watching, liking, commenting, things like that. But if you want to go a step further and support the content on another level, go and check out the ChemKnits Patreon. Again, there will be a link down in the video description. Thank you so much for watching.